Hello, everybody. This is Debbie Powell. I'm the Master Gardener Coordinator for both Calaveras and Tuolumne County. We are so fortunate for our virtual open garden to have Sue Mossbacher and Chris DeRose as our presenters for our topic called Preserving Your Harvest. We're all planning to have wonderful harvests, so you got to know what to do with it. And Sue Mossbacher is in charge of the Master Food Preserver program and also the Master Gardener program. At this moment, she is stepping in. Hopefully it's a temporary position, but she is the acting statewide coordinator, and that covers Sacramento, El Dorado County, Amador County, Calaveras, and Calaveras County. She was certified as a Master Food Preserver back in 2011, so she's got some experience under her belt besides all the other qualifying experiences. Chris DeRose, she retired in 2013, so in 2015, that's when she became a Master Food Preserver. She is a retired teacher. She's got wonderful experience. She moved to Tuolumne County, just to let you know, in 1981. And I believe Chris has been, for most of her life, been preserving food, but she's been certified since 2013. So I want to welcome them. And Sue?
Yes?
How about if you just take it away?
All right. Okay. So thank you guys for being here today. I'm excited to share the passion that Chris and I both have for food preservation. Normally we could do 3 hours on each of these topics. We're going to try and squeeze everything into just an hour and a half. This is our agenda. We're going to start out with, we've done introductions. We're going to do some basic food safety. We're going to spend about 10 minutes on freezing highlights and leave a little bit of time for a demo and some Q&A at the end of that. And then we're going to move into dehydrating highlights. And then we're going to take a break. And as Debbie said, we can answer some questions then. And then we're going to talk about high acid canning, some highlights of that. And Chris is going to do a demo for that. And then we'll wrap things up with Q&A. And Chris and I are willing to stick around till we can get all your questions answered. Debbie, if you could put in the chat box the recipe handouts.
It's right there.
Is it perfect? Okay, I'm not looking at the chat.
Okay.
We will be posting all of the handouts and the recording on the Central Sierra websites for the Master Food Preservers and also the Master Gardeners in Tuolumne County. So you don't have to worry about taking notes if you can, but all the handouts will be available and we have lots of information. Okay, so I'm going to start a little bit. Many of you are probably Master Gardeners. You've attended their events, so you know the Master Gardeners teach research-based information on home gardening, and we take the next step. And once you've harvested everything, we teach research-based practices for safe home food preservation. So all of the recipes and the methods that we're going to be talking about today are research-based, so that you know that they've been proven to be effective and safe. Our main goal is to make sure people don't get sick. Here's our website, ucanr.edu/MFPCS for Master Food Preservers, Central Sierra. On that website, we have phone numbers for helpline. You can send emails for help questions. On our website, you can ask a Master Food Preserver and submit questions there. And then we have active Facebook pages in Amador County and El Dorado, and people answer questions there as well. Throughout this presentation, we're going to be showing lots of products, talking about lots of products. They're all examples. None of them are endorsements. All right, so what's in the handouts that you guys will have available on the internet, on our main website? I have 4 handouts, and some of you who've attended our classes may already have received these. There's one on food safety basics, freezing basics, dehydrating, core canning techniques, and then I have information about making fruit spreads and pickling fruits and vegetables. And then I have a document for recipes, and it's already in the chat box. So if you want to download it, you can follow along, or I'll show you which pages they're on and you can look at them later. One of the benefits of doing classes remotely is I don't have to worry about printing too many copies. So there's 24 pages of recipes. We have lots of them. I had to stop myself. We will also be sending an email to all the attendees afterwards with the links to the recording and all the documents. So you won't be able to not find it. So we're going to start with food safety basics. The first thing is food safety starts before you get into the kitchen. It's out when you're out in the garden. So when you're harvesting your produce, you want to make sure that you're using clean tools and a clean container, and then knock the clods of dirt off of your product. If you've got, a zucchini that's been sitting on the ground, it's got a lump of mud on the bottom, just brush it off, use your hands to rub it off. You only want to rinse the product just before you're using it. You don't want to waterlog it, and you don't want to soak it in water. You want to just use water and rinse it off. Make sure you clean and sanitize your work area and your tools. One benefit of this pandemic is we all know how to clean our counters, and we know how to clean our hands and sanitize our work area. So make sure you take care of that. And then you want to have your hair either pulled back or covered. And the common and most obvious result of this is so that your hair doesn't get into your food. But the other thing is you don't want to be fussing with your hair and pulling it back out of your face and touching your hair and then touching the food. You want to keep your hands clean. And so by having it pulled back, and Chris will be demonstrating that, I'm not going to be working with any food. So keep your hair pulled back. If you have hair that tends to fly out no matter what, you can wear a bandana or some kind of a head covering. Make sure you have on a clean apron, because the purpose of the apron is not only to protect your food from anything that splatters, but more importantly, to protect your food from anything you have on your clothes. If you have pets or you've been going inside and outside, your clothes probably aren't as clean as they should be for working in a sanitary kitchen environment. So having a clean apron protects your food from you. And then make sure your toes are covered. If you're going to be working with hot water, things splash, burns the toes, slippery in the hands, can drop knives, and you want to make sure that you've got a layer of protection with your toes. All right, so that's the setup. The food preservation, why we do it. There's a main reason, and that's to keep foodborne pathogens from growing in our food. Pathogens grow in our food, we eat it, we get sick. So we want to make sure that they do not grow. So we do that one of two ways. We either destroy the pathogens or we inhibit their growth. So the way that we have long-term storage methods to do this is we can freeze food, and that prevents the pathogens from growing. It does not kill them. I like to think of it as little bear bacteria in hibernation. So they're still alive, they're just not doing anything, just laying there, staying alive. And once you thaw them, then the bacteria is still alive and it will continue to grow. Dehydrating gets rid of the moisture. Pathogens need moisture to grow. So if you get rid of the moisture, the pathogens can't grow. And when we dehydrate fruits and vegetables, we remove enough moisture so that there's only about 20% moisture remaining in fruit and 10% moisture in vegetables. And at those levels, as long as you've stored it properly, bacteria will not grow. So with those two, we inhibit the growth of the bacteria. With canning, we have to destroy it. And so when we can, our goal is to destroy all the molds, bacteria, yeast, parasites, anything that might be in there. And so we destroy the foodborne pathogens, and then we create a sealed and essentially pasteurized shelf-stable product. So the bacteria, well, there isn't any that's left, but there's nothing to grow. So we have two different canning methods, and the item that determines how we choose which method we use is the acidity of the food. So over here in this yellow section, we have fruits and a pickled product. So if we can take a vegetable and we acidify it with vinegar, it has a high enough acid that we can use our boiling water canner. Tomatoes are kind of borderline, figs are borderline, Asian pears are borderline, and so we're going to make sure we acidify those so that they're safely up in this range. So for those products, we use a boiling water canner or an atmospheric steam canner. with low acid foods, and those are vegetables and meats and dairies, things like that. We don't can dairy. But if we were going to can vegetables and meats and beans, we would use a pressure canner. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. We're not going to demonstrate pressure canning today. I just want to make sure you understand that if you're going to be canning just straight vegetables, then you would pressure can it. And in the core canning basics handout, it has the instructions for that. All right, so why the two canning methods? It's all because of the bacteria Clostridium botulinum. It's a tricky little bugger. It does not grow in high acid foods, but it grows in low acid foods. So if we have this bacteria in a jam or a jelly or in a jar of peaches, it won't grow because those are high acid foods. We can be eating them and our stomach is very acidic, and so it won't grow, it'll just pass through. The environment that it needs to grow is a low acid food, which is our vegetables and meats, moist, and so water, and it can't grow in oxygen, it needs an anaerobic environment, and it needs to grow at room temperature. So if you take a can of green beans and you cover it with boiling water, and then you have that in your jar, you have a low acid food. You've got the water in there, so there's moisture. When you can it, you force all the air out, so now you have an anaerobic environment, and it's up on your counter, which is room temperature. So that's the perfect environment. And so when it's in that environment, it will grow and create a toxin that's called botulinum. And when you open up that jar and you serve it for dinner and you eat it, then you can get the disease botulism. So what we have to do is make sure we kill it. Well, unfortunately, when it's in an environment where it can't grow, like out on the dirt or on our vegetables, it creates this spore, a protective spore around it. And it's very hard and it does its job well. And its job is to keep the bacteria alive and protected until it's in an environment where it can grow. The spore is very strong and hardy, and it takes a temperature of 240 degrees to kill the spore, which you then will kill the bacteria. And no matter how hard you boil, how hard of a boil you have and how many bubbles, you're never going to get to 240 degrees. So you have to use a pressure canner to increase the temperature to 240 degrees. So that's why you would need a pressure canner to kill low acid foods. And there's no uniform distribution. We don't know where the bacteria is. So we assume that it will always be present. It's better safe than sorry. So anytime we're canning just a straight low acid food, we pressure can it to ensure that if the bacteria is there, it's killed. So that's why there's two methods. We are going to be just talking about high acid foods, not the low acid foods today. So we're going to be able to just use boiling water and steam canner. All right, so the recipes that we're going to use, we want to make sure people use current reputable recipes and methods. And that means that the recipes themselves or the process is based on research. A lot of things have changed since grandma's canning days. The acidity of vinegar has changed. They've done research to show that just because you scrape off the mold on jelly doesn't mean that there's more mold that you can't see throughout the jar. There have been changes, and we want to make sure that people stay safe. And so the recipes that you use need to follow the USDA or the National Center for Home Food Preservation recommendations. So that means we don't do open kettle canning. And open kettle canning is where you take hot food, you put it in hot jars, you fill it up almost to the top, you put a lid and a ring on it, you turn the jar upside down, it forces the air out to create a vacuum seal. You may have a sealed jar, but the air that was in there wasn't sterilized, and we have all kinds of stuff floating around in our air as far as the pathogen world goes, and you didn't pasteurize or sterilize the product to make sure that nothing will grow in there. So that's not a method we recommend. We don't recommend canning in the oven, and sometimes people will say, but my oven gets up, I can it at 360 degrees, and that's, a lot higher than boiling water. But the heat transfer in the oven is very different than the heat transfer in boiling water. I have no problem taking my plain old bare hand with a thermometer, sticking it in a 400-degree oven to put something, to check the temperature of the meat and pulling it out. I would never do that in boiling water. It's because heat transfers differently in air than it does in water. And so we want to make sure that our recipes have been tested for boiling water, and that's what we use, or the process. And then we don't use the paraffin wax seals anymore. We don't recommend those. When people did paraffin wax sealing, mainly with jams and jellies, a lot of folks had a root cellar. And you would keep the jars at a consistent temperature. And so the wax would complete the seal. Well, again, we have the same issues with open kettle canning. We didn't process it, so there could have been pathogens still in the product that can grow. And also, when winter comes and the cold constricts the wax, it can pull away from the side of the jar. Pathogens can go in. In my house, ants would go in. And then when the wax warms up, it will reseal all those things inside the product. And so we don't recommend using a wax seal either. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I want to can this fabulous restaurant with a recipe that has these vegetables and all this good stuff. If you don't have a recipe, just put it in the freezer. It works fine that way because then the pathogens won't grow. But you don't want to take a risk of getting people sick. All right, so that in a nutshell is the basic food safety. In the handouts that will be on the website, there's the food safety basics. It has a lot more information. And again, we're going to email it to you after the class. Not today, I'm not promising that. And then there's also the National Center for Home Food Preservation. It has a lot of information on it as well. So are there any basic questions on the food safety issues before we move on to freezing?
There aren't any questions in the chat.
Perfect. I'm a minute ahead of schedule. This is the only time that happens. All right, so we're going to move on to freezing highlights. And it's interesting because people have been freezing a long time, but there are just two main things that I want to talk about for freezing, just to help have some more successful freezing experiences with your food. And one, I want to address creating an acceptable texture, because you're never going to have the same quality and texture of a product coming out of the freezer as you go in. And so I want to show you or explain what you can do to help make it good and not too mushy. And then also the big concern is no freezer burn. This happens a lot in my house when people try and help clean up afterwards, and they'll take, a bag of mixed vegetables and just roll it up, put a rubber band around it so it doesn't fall out, and throw it in the freezer, and then this is what comes out. And so I want to make sure everybody understands what freezer burn is and how we can prevent it. Okay, so first, the acceptable texture. We need to understand what happens when we put food in the freezer. There's natural water in all foods. When water freezes, it expands. And so that means that the water in our food is expanding, and those ice crystals, they rupture the cell walls. That's why you get the mushy food, because the water is broken down the tissues. And one thing to know is when frozen food, where the water molecules, when they start to warm up, they will migrate together, they clump together, they make larger drops of water, which makes, when you refreeze it, you have a larger ice crystal. You have a larger ice crystal, it's going to do more damage to your cell walls. So if you have things thawing, almost thawing, warming up a little bit and then freezing again, warming up and freezing again, the texture is going to be very poor because it's going to keep rupturing the cells and they're mush. So the big thing is if you want small ice crystals, you need to freeze the foods fast. And then you want to keep the foods frozen. Again, the water molecules will clump together. You want to make sure that you have small droplets of water in your food and not large ones. And as an FYI, thawed foods spoil faster than fresh food because the cell walls, they're ruptured, so the bacteria has easier access to the nutrients that are in your food. So it's another reason why you want to make sure you thaw your foods in the refrigerator and not on the counter, because the bacteria will grow even more rapidly at room temperature than it will in the refrigerator. So we want to keep our foods frozen. So that means you don't stand at the refrigerator or at the freezer door and try and figure out what am I going to have for dinner. In my house, I tend to keep my juices, any frozen broths, things like that, where it doesn't matter what the texture is, on the freezer door, because that's what's going to be the warmest area. And so if those thaw and freeze, they're liquid, so it's not going to impact the texture. But that could be a cause of why you've got problems with texture on some of the other foods if they're warming up and refreezing. Okay, so preventing freezer burn. Freezer burn is just moisture that's in the food. It's evaporated into air in your container in the freezer, and then it freezes. And sometimes you get the little stalagmites growing up, sometimes just a frost over them, and then the food will start to discolor. It's pretty gross. So things that you want to do before you put things in the freezer is to remove surface moisture. If you get rid of the extra moisture, that's not going to freeze outside of your product. And then you want to make sure you use freezer containers. These are designed to keep air out. If you just throw something in the freezer in a sandwich baggies are designed to let air move in and out, because otherwise you'll have a soggy sandwich from the condensation. So you need to make sure that you do use freezer containers, and a lot of them will have a little snowflake on the bottom. And so that way you know it is designed to be a freezer container. And then you buy specific freezer container plastic bags. And then once you've got the right container, you want to get as much air out and then keep it out, because if there isn't any air for the moisture to evaporate into, then it won't have the ice crystals that freeze because there's no air. So there's a couple of things you can do, and Chris is going to show you a very simple method where you take a straw in a plastic bag and you push as much air out of it as possible, and then with the straw in at the very last part of the non-zipped bag seal, you just breathe in and pull out as much air as you can. And it's amazing how much air you can get rid of in a bag that way. You can also use commercial vacuum sealers. And also if you have these type of containers, just a hard-sided container, and if there's extra space in there, then go ahead and either like lay some plastic wrap across the top or scrunch up some freezer paper like this. This is peaches in a syrup. And so the peaches are actually under the liquid, so they won't get freezer burn, but then you might still have some ice crystals on the top, so you can take up the space in there with some crumpled up parchment or freezer paper. Okay, another thing is if you've got canning jars, they are tempered to go in the hot water and also into the freezer. But you want to make sure that you use jars that have straight edges and not the rounded shoulders, because if you have liquid in there, freezing water is just like a glacier. It will force its way through. It would be nice if it would conform to the shape of the container, but it doesn't. So you could have cracked jars if you have food that expands up and breaks the shoulders of the jar. But it's interesting. You can buy freezer or wide mouth jars that are designed for freezing, and they will say on here, for freezing, fill here. It's kind of hard to see that part, but there's this little seam right underneath the bottom rim. It's kind of hard to see, but there's a little line, and that tells you when you're putting in something that may expand, tomato sauce, pesto, juices, whatever, that's the line you fill it to so that there's room to expand in the rest of the jar. But you don't have to buy just jars that are designed for the freezer or marketed for the freezer. All of your wide mouth canning jars, if you look at them, they have this little rim underneath there, and that's at about a 1.5 inch head space. And so that's the line that you use to fill liquids or liquid-like products in your freezer. And so that way they won't break. So you already have a lot of freezer containers in your cupboards. All right, so another thing that is very common is to do a tray pack. Sometimes it's called a dry pack, or an individual quick freeze, IQF. And that's where you take whole produce and that you want to use individually, and you freeze them individually. When I first moved to our property here, we have all these wild blackberries, and I was so excited. And I picked them, I rinsed them, I dried them off, and I put them in a baggie. And when I pulled it out, I had one clump of frozen berries. It's like, well, I guess I'm using them all at one time. So since then, I've learned. And so what you do is you take the berries, I've done this with green beans, I've done it with sliced peppers, you can do it with rhubarb chunks, just about anything, where you rinse them off, dry them. You want to get the moisture off as much as possible and put them on a small tray or a plate. I like to put parchment paper underneath it. You can use a silicone mat or aluminum foil, and then you put that in the freezer. And I like to use a little toaster oven tray. It's a nice quarter size cookie sheet, fits perfectly. And then you freeze them. When they're frozen individually, then you move them to a container. And so here's some of my blackberries. And it's nice when you've got either parchment paper or foil or a silicone pad underneath it, you can just pick that up and then pour it into a bag or a container. And that way, when you want just a handful of berries or just a handful of peppers, you can take just a few. And then just a reminder, we had this the other night as we were sitting watching TV, frozen berries and frozen grapes, it's like eating candy. They're like little mini popsicles, they're delicious. All right, so I've got a couple of quick pictures here. Here's some blueberries, here's some rhubarb slices, so they're on the trays. And then if they stick, you just take a spatula and scrape them off, and then you put them in a bag, pretty easy. All right, I have a tip. So blackberries, raspberries, they have all these little nooks and crannies where the water can get in there. And so when you freeze them, you'll have a lot of times this layer of ice over them. And so you can dry them, you can take paper towels, pat them, but if they're delicate, you may bruise them and squish them, and it's impossible to get all that moisture off. A former nutrition advisor showed me this trick. You use a hair dryer on low setting and run it over the fruit. And so that way it will help force the evaporation in all those nooks and crannies in your berries. And then I do this and I pull up my berries from the freezer, and they're just beautiful, dark, black, purplish berries. And I have very little frost on them. I have learned that since I don't have a diffuser, that if you just take your hair dryer and you put them on a cookie sheet and you dry the berries, they kind of roll all over the place. So I put them in a little muffin tin, and it keeps them from rolling all over. Okay, freezing tomatoes. This is the easiest way to preserve tomatoes, especially if you get a bumper crop of tomatoes and you just are not going to be spending the next week in your kitchen canning them all. So if you freeze them, so easy. You just make sure you rinse them and dry them. You can freeze them whole. Remove the little stem scar, put them in on a tray, or you can put them in a bag and just leave the air, open it up so that the air can get in there easier. When they're frozen, you put them in a freezer bag, get rid of the air, and stick them in the freezer. Date them, obviously. And then when you're ready to use, it's so nice. You run them under warm water, and I like to let them thaw just a little bit so they've got a bit of give to them, but then the skins come off. So you don't have to pre-peel them, you don't have to cut them, you don't have to core them, just remove the stem scar. And true confessions, I put them in with the stem scar on. And so it makes it nice because then you can can them or do whatever you want. Cook them, make your own sauce for dinner, and you just chop them up and away you go. So it's a great way to preserve tomatoes. And then if you want to make sauces later, you can. And then here's a tip for chopped onions, but this would work with just about everything. I had a volunteer who used to buy 25-pound bags of onions, and I have another volunteer who grows lots and lots of onions. And so chop up the onions. They use one of those little quick chop tools where you just slice them and chop, 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 chop. But then what you do is you use regular baggies, not freezer baggies, the cheap ones, the twisty ties, the fold over sandwich baggies. Mark the quantity. So you may do half cup, quarter cup, full cup, different proportions that you need for meals. And then put them in the baggies, get rid of as much air if you can, and then put all those small baggies into a large freezer bag, remove the air, and then put it in the freezer. So then when you need some onions, you just pull out a bag, and then again, you get the air out of the large freezer bag and seal it back up and put it back in the freezer. But that saves you a little bit of money because freezer bags are more expensive than cheap sandwich bags. And so that way you can pre-measure your onions or peppers, chopped onions, or celery, whatever you want to use, and save a little bit of money and have everything ready to go just to pull out from the freezer. Okay, so that's the basics. Freeze food fast and keep it frozen, and then make sure there's no air and no moisture to freeze to cause your freezer burn, and use the right tools. So let's see.
Hey, Sue,
Yeah.
we do have a question, and
Okay.
it's when PG&E power outage is short, like ice cream is soft, not liquid, we eat the ice cream. But what about meats and frozen fruits or veggies? Keep or toss out?
If there's still ice crystals in them, You can use them and you can refreeze them, but pay attention to the quality of it. And if it's completely thawed, the general rule of thumb is, if it's more than 95 degrees out, you can't keep things out for an hour, more than an hour at room temperature. So if it's been thawed for a while, you need to get rid of it, unfortunately. A full freezer will last between 2 to 4 days, shoot for 2 days. And so make sure that you've always got it full. And it could just be empty milk jugs with water that freeze. But if it's frozen, if the freezer is full, it will last longer and stay colder. You can always put dry ice in there, wrap it with cardboard or moving blankets to help insulate it. But yeah, if it is thawed and has not been refrigerated, you unfortunately need to get rid of it. And I have some more information in the handouts about what to do when the power goes out, although I kind of told you. But there's also information there about pre-treating fruits and vegetables. You want to blanch vegetables, and then labeling and storage time. Labeling is very important because, trust me, frozen grapefruit juice looks a lot like frozen chicken stock, and you don't want to make that mistake of mixing the two. It also talks about thawing fruits and vegetables, and then there's some recipes. All right, so we're going to go to a freezing demonstration. So Chris is going to show how to freeze or how to make and freeze a zucchini pesto. Chris is such a fabulous cook, and she comes up with the greatest ideas. And then she's also going to show you some blanched broccoli. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then Debbie, if you could spotlight Chris, please.
She's spotlight.
Great, thank you.
Chris, you're on.
Okay. I have everything. Hi, I'm Krista Rose. I'm here, and I'm wearing my head covering and my clean apron. I'm going to tip this so you can see what I've my blender. The zucchini recipe you have has onions, garlic, a little olive oil. It has lemon juice, lemon zest, and some basil and Parmesan cheese. If you have a food processor, it just takes a matter of moments. I've already cooked my zucchini, my garlic, and my onions. So it's ready to just take 2 seconds to plop in here. And this will be an excellent thing. If you have too much zucchini, you can put it on bread, use it as a dip. That's what my daughter-in-law likes it. I put it on grilled veggies. So here's my chopped up pesto, my basil for the pesto. Some Parmesan cheese. 1 cup. The recipe is in there. A bunch of basil, 1 cup, a squeeze of lemon and some lemon zest ready to go in. And then we just have to lock our lid and, so excuse the noise. Stop and scrape down your edges. You always have a few that get away. And I'm pretty sure you'd enjoy this as just a dip on a hot day. Now, when it comes to freezing this, it's good to have it in individual portions. I use these little heart molds just because they're silicone, they turn inside out, and I can pop them out without breaking the mold, which I've done. So we're going to fill the molds with the pesto. I have some ready to pop out. That doesn't take you any time. Just plop them in. And clean up your edges. And you're ready to freeze. I like to cover these up and make sure I put it on a metal pan because they're very flexible. So I'm going to take you over here. I have some broccoli and some pesto we made yesterday for your video. These are in another mold, my labeled baggie, and I'm going to show you how to remove air. Just pop a couple out. Pop them in your bag. These are about 2-3 tablespoons. I have also a larger one that is, they're down here, 1/3 of a cup, which might be a better dip. This would be good on grilled veggies. So you're gonna plop in as many as you want. And I would just fill the bag, but we're watching your time. And you want to zip it to the straw, push out as much air as you can. And here's the vacuum. And you can see it made a pretty good vacuum seal. So those are ready to freeze. I just fold them over. And then we have some broccoli. This broccoli has been blanched and is in a beautiful bright green. I went to farmer's market last weekend, had too many veggies, so I've been canning them, pickling them, and blanching them. So fill your bag, squeeze out your air. Insert your straw in the corner. Suck it out. So there you're ready to freeze. And that's my freezing demonstration that I did. Okay.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah.
That broccoli looks so beautiful.
Yes, it will be wonderful. If I remember to not eat before, I'll have something nice and green in the winter.
Yep. Awesome. So yeah, so the freezing is very easy. Some of the recipes that we have in the handout are for the zucchini basil spread, a preserved lemon kale pesto, carrot greens chimichurri, beet green pesto, cilantro pumpkin seed pesto, carrot top pesto, and then freezing tomatoes. So all kinds of things that you're growing in your garden and you may not have thought about using them this way. Hopefully you don't get rid of your carrot greens or your beet greens, but here's some fun things that you can do with them. So any questions on freezing? I know we're already behind. Oh, well. No? All right, then let's move on and we'll talk about dehydrating. And so with drying, again, remember we're removing the moisture so pathogens can't grow. I'm going to turn my video on. And so the general temperature that is most commonly used is 140 degrees or less. It really depends on the recipe that you're following. Some of them are 135, some 140. With herbs, we dry them at 95 to 115 if we're using a dehydrator. So the big thing is you follow the instructions. And remember, if you're in a hurry, if you increase the temperature, you're gonna cook the food instead of drying it. Just like you don't cut down the time for cooking a roast by increasing the temperature to 500, we make sure that we have a low dry temperature because the purpose is just to force the air to evaporate and not to cook the food. And dehydrating works best when we have low humidity and air current. We're very fortunate that we don't live in a humid environment because the purpose then is that the air circulation speeds up the drying and it removes the air around it. And you have to make sure that the air can penetrate the whole food piece. If you're drying blueberries, for example, the skin of the blueberry's job is to keep the environment away from what's inside. And so if you just throw your whole little blueberry on a dehydrator tray and let it dry, the skin is going to dry, but inside will be moist and get moldy. So you need to make sure the air can get in there. So if you have a kid who needs something to do, you can give them a bowl of blueberries and a toothpick and have them poke a couple holes in each and every single one of the blueberries. Or you can drop them in boiling water just long enough for the skins to crack, and then you can go ahead and dehydrate them. And then the other thing to remember is that when you store them, air is not your friend. A lot of times people think that their crackers have gone bad because they're soft. No, they're just rehydrating. They're a dried food, and when you expose them to the air, there's natural moisture in our air and it rehydrates. So we want to make sure we keep the air out of our storage. And so you can store them in a cool, dry, dark place, just like we do with our canning goods. You can put them in the freezer, use packaging that's designed for freezing, or you can put them in the refrigerator. So for optimum quality, not food safety, because they'll be fine longer, they just won't look as good. Fruit, you can keep it a year at 60 degrees if you've got a nice cool storage space, or 6 months at 80, and vegetables, it's about half the shelf life. And again, that's for the optimum quality. It's not a food safety issue. So here we've got some put in a nice freezer, and notice all the juices are on the door. All right, so when you're packaging, you want to use airtight containers. You want to make sure that they protect the food if you've got something that's crushable, if you've got zucchini chips or potatoes slices, and then you can use vacuum sealers as well. And one of the things I love is using my canister option on my vacuum sealer. And so what you do is, and this is where I use used lids, you have a jar of a dried food, and these are nuts. You put your lid on top, and then this attachment here sits on top of this. You press the canister button and it vacuums out all the air. And then when it's pulled out enough air, it stops. And then you have a vacuum seal. And so you can't have any air go in or out of the jar. And so it really does a great job on keeping things nice and airtight. Okay, so different ways that you can dry food. And if any of you are growing beans, this is one of the easiest things to do. You just don't pick them. You let them dry. And when they start to sound like a rattlesnake, they're dry. So you pick them, and then you take the beans out of the shell, and you're ready for the next step. And I'll tell you about that in a moment. So vine drying is very easy. You can also do solar or sun drying. I'm not going to talk about that one here. You can also technically dry things in the oven. If you have a convection oven, that's fine because you have air circulating. But the recommendation is if you have a regular oven, you're supposed to first make sure your oven can go down to the low temperature that it needs to. You're supposed to prop the door open and have a fan so it can have air blowing. And things take, 10, 12 hours, and I'm not paying for the gas to have that happening with my oven. So it's not used that often. I know Chris is very fortunate. She has a commercial grade oven, and it has a warming tray that's always at about 100 degrees, and so she can dry things in there. I just stole your thunder. Sorry, Chris. You can also do room drying, and we're going to talk about that, and then electric dryers. Okay, so I want to have my picture on there already. Room drying herbs. So herbs, again, are lower temperature. You can microwave them, room dry dehydrator. If you microwave them, please read the instructions. Every microwave has different wattages, but you can actually burn up your herbs if you have them too high of a temperature and too long, because they are very fragile. So make sure you read the directions. We have one of our volunteers, Noreen, who uses the microwave a lot to dry her herbs, and she has beautifully dried herbs. So it works, but read the directions. This is also Noreen's herb dryer. You can just put your herbs out and hang them. This looks really pretty. You can buy inexpensive or more costly dryers. This thing here is a fish fry. You can get them for about $10. And it has netting so that you can hang your herbs up outside and just let them dry naturally. I'm going to show you what I do. I have oregano that's gone wild. I have lots of it everywhere, and I love using it in my cooking. So I will cut a bunch of stems. I rinse them and I pat them dry. And then I take a rubber band and I rubber band a bunch of them together at the ends of the stems. And I use a rubber band because as they dry, they're going to shrivel, and this way the rubber band will hold them in place. I've tried it with just a twisty tie, and they tend to fall out because the twisty tie doesn't move. So after I've got them zip or rubber band together, then I put a little twisty tie underneath the rubber band and I hang it up in a handled bag. And notice I have slices in the side of the bag. I just take scissors and I cut it and then I hang it up to dry. So now I have a way for air circulation to come in. I've got the bottom of the bag, so if anything falls off of it as it's drying, it doesn't land on the kitchen floor, it lands in the bottom of the bag. And then when I'm done, I just take it off and I remove just the whole leaves and I don't crush them until I'm ready to use them. And people always ask, well, how long does it take to dry? I think only a few days. I tend to put it up there and I forget about it. But you just check it and the herbs are so thin that they dry very quickly. Okay, so after you do that, with room drying, with vine drying, one of the things that you need to do is make sure there's no insect larvae on there. And so once you've brought in your vine dried beans or your oregano that's just been hanging out in the bag, you need to, we call it pasteurizing. It's technically not because pasteurizing kills pathogens, but it's the same concept and it's just the generally used term. But we pasteurize the room dried and vine dried foods. And so the simplest method is just to put it in the freezer and freeze it for 2 days, or you can put it in an oven and heat it, preheat the oven to 160 and keep it in there for 30 minutes. I prefer the freezer method because it doesn't impact the quality very much. If you think about it, there's no moisture in there, so the quality of the food or the texture of the food doesn't really change. But that way you don't have bugs that are surprising you and webs and things like that when you open it up a couple months later. And this is optional for other, if you use the electric dehydrator, because insects, the larvae are killed, it's either 100 or 135 degrees. And so if you're using an electric dehydrator at that temperature for 10 to 12 hours, you don't need to worry about pasteurizing. Some people do just because they do it for everything. It won't impact it at all, but it's not a required step. You just need to do it with room and vine drying. Okay, electric dehydrators. You need to make sure that you have a temperature control, a fan, and a heat source. And so I've got a couple of pictures of some things here. This will be faster than trying to haul everything out and show you over the Zoom. So this one here, the fan and the heat source are on the back and it blows forward. This one here, the heat source is on the bottom and then the heat blows up. One of the things that you need to do is to remember that the things that are closest to the fan and the heat source are going to dry faster than the things on top. So about halfway you should rotate through. These are just manuals and these are digital versions. And then I have a version where the heat source is on the top. And again, the fan's gonna blow down. And so you need to rotate the trays on the bottom with the trays on the top. Excuse me, so you have things dry more evenly. Well, one of the things you may find in your basement or at a garage sale is these old style dehydrators that just have an on-off switch and there's no thermostat. And you're thinking, well, can I use this? Pull out a thermometer, put it in there, let it run for a while and see what temperature it goes up to. You may be able to use it for some products, but maybe not for herbs, but you need to find out what temperature it's at. And this is a good idea to check whatever electric dehydrator you have to check the accuracy of the thermostat. And so one of the reminders when you're using your electric dehydrators, well, even with if you're going to be room drying things, you want to make sure that you slice your food in uniform thick slices because that way they'll dry more evenly. If you have a mishmash of large pieces, small pieces, thick pieces, thin pieces, the thinner pieces and the smaller pieces will dry faster. And so you're either spend your time pulling out the tray, picking out the pieces that are dry and continuing to dry the others, or if you just wait till everything's dry, some of them are going to be crispy and shriveled up and pretty much only good for grinding up into a powder. And you want to make sure that your pieces are spaced out so that there is some air. I look at these and there is some air, but they were still a little closer than what I would lay them out because you want to make sure that you've got plenty of air circulation. They'll dry faster if there's lots of space around them. Okay, how do you tell if it's dry? If it's fruit, you check, is it tacky? And I have, let's see, I'm going to stop my share for a second. and show this. This is my little sacrificial piece of apple. And so you can see that when I fold it down, it does not stick to each other. And so this is dry, it's pliable and leathery. There's no moisture, and it's at about 20% moisture, but the big thing, it's pliable, it's not sticky. And let me go back. All right, so that's how you tell that fruit is dry. And one of the things, and so here's a picture of some beautiful apricots. So one of the things that you need to do next is, after you dry the fruit, you need to do something called conditioning. So first you wait about 30 minutes to an hour before putting it in any kind of packaging, because if you put a warm product in a jar and seal it, you're going to get condensation and defeat the whole purpose of drying this food. So you want to make sure that you wait half an hour to an hour, make sure it's cool, and then you put it in a jar with shoulders and you close it. And if you get any condensation on the shoulder, it'll trap it, then you know that it's not dry enough. And then what you want to do, let's see, will it work? Yeah. You want to shake it a couple times a day for 2 to 4 days. And in my house, my husband is fabulous. And he knows that if he finds jars of dried food or olives, when we're processing olives, next to his coffee maker at night, then his job is, when he's getting the coffee ready for the next morning, he takes a jar, he shakes it, and he moves it to the other side of the sink. And then the next morning when he's pouring his coffee, he takes the jar and he shakes it and he moves it to the other side of the sink. Best husband in the world. And so you want to keep doing that, because what it does is it helps equalize the moisture, because no matter how hard you try, you're not going to get your slices exactly the same. Different pieces of fruit will have more moisture than others. And so what this does is it redistributes some of the excess moisture in some fruit into some of the extra dry pieces of fruit. And so it just balances it out. And so you do that for a couple of days. If it lasts that long, sometimes you just eat everything very quickly. All right, so that's the core basics of drying fruit. With vegetables, it's a little bit different. Here I have some zucchini slices. With a lot of vegetables, like if you were going to do broccoli, dehydrating broccoli, I don't know if I'd do that. But anyway, carrots and things like that, you want to blanch them first. And what blanching does is it destroys the enzymes that impact flavor and texture. It makes them brighter color, and it protects vitamins in the color of the product. And so in the handouts, we have blanching times, and there's a couple of things. I know how to blanch. You put it in boiling water and you take it out. But there's a second step. You have to put it in an ice bath, because when you're blanching it, you cook it, and then you need to stop the cooking. So you put it in the ice bath. And so if the blanching time is 3 minutes, you're supposed to boil it for 3 minutes. You need to put it in 3 minutes also for the ice bath. And you want to work in small batches. If it takes longer than a minute to bring the water back up to a boil after you put your food in it, you've put too much in. So just put in small amounts at a time. So you have 3 minutes or however many minutes in your boiling, then you put it in your ice bath, and you can put another batch in the boiling, and you just keep drying, and then you can go ahead and put it in the dehydrator. So is the vegetable dry? 10% moisture and brittle. And so they're very thin, and I have, let's see, stop share. I've got a couple of things here. I have carrots. This is a dried carrot and a little carrot round. They are rock hard, brittle. I can break it. It's not going to be pliable and leathery, so they're very, very firm. I have some garlic. You can hear it. They're like little rocks. I like to dehydrate the garlic, and then whenever I want garlic powder, I just grind up a couple of cloves, and I have fresh garlic powder, and it smells great. All right, let me go back to my screen. All right, so that's when the vegetables are dry. So do you need to condition vegetables like you do with the fruit? No, there's no moisture in there. So you do not need to worry about conditioning vegetables. And that's where you would put it in the jar and just shake it every day for 2 to 4 days. Once it's dry, just put it in your storage container and you're good to go. And then a real quick thing on rehydrating fruits and vegetables. Fruits, you're gonna just soak them in room temperature water. Vegetables, you soak in boiling water. And in the handout, I have a chart, and I'm gonna expand this in a second, on the recommended times to rehydrate. And a lot of times people will just throw things in soups and just let it rehydrate. Well, it depends on how the quality of the fruit the food that you want when it's rehydrated. So carrots. Noreen, one of our master food preservers, taught a class last year with others, and it was on dehydrating and rehydrating. And she did some examples where she was drying carrots and then rehydrating them. Some she would just throw them in the soup, heat it for 10 minutes and eat it. And her husband's like, this is like rubber. It was not very good. And so she actually followed the directions, and she said, look at the difference it makes. So she wanted to experience what people do and then what you should do. And so this is what she does for carrots, and it works great. So you're supposed to take your carrots and soak it for an hour. And so I'm going to show you here. So this is my little dried carrot, and this is what it is rehydrated. And when you rehydrate it, it is pliable and soft. I had put it in a little container with boiling water about half an hour before we started the session. And it's just nice and soft and pliable. My little dried carrot and my rehydrated carrot, nice and soft and pliable, and it's not rubbery when you cook it. One of the nice things about dehydrating food is this is like a 5-pound bag of carrots in a little teeny jar. And so when you get rid of the moisture, the space savings is great. And then things don't go moldy either. All right, so got that. So follow the directions and the recommendations. They're there for a reason because they work. Okay, so I have just a couple of quick show and tell things. Let's see, I showed my garlic. I showed the carrots, I showed apples. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share, and then I'm gonna show a couple things, and then Chris is too. So I have potato slices, and these are nice and brittle. But the nice thing about this is if you've got potatoes, can I call these carrots? These are potatoes. The potatoes are nice and thin. You can dry them. So if you get you always can get a great deal on potatoes, but you dry the slices, and then you can easily use them to make scalloped potatoes, fried potatoes, so you can rehydrate them. You don't have to worry about the storage space. This was several pound bag of potatoes, and it's in a little baggie. We showed the garlic. One of the other things is tomato powder. And so if you have tomato skins or soft tomatoes, you can puree them, make a leather, or you can just take the tomatoes and dry them till they're crispy and then grind them up into a tomato powder. And the flavor is very condensed. And some of the things you can do with this is if you want 1 tablespoon of tomato paste, you can make 1 tablespoon of tomato paste. You can use this to make some soup mixes to take camping or backpacking. You can sprinkle some on your eggs so you can have some extra flavoring without the moisture of having fresh tomatoes on there. You can add it to soups. You can add it to meatloaf. There's all kinds of things you can do with it. And then you're not wasting your tomato skins. You can also take your tomato skins and dry them until they're crispy. Add some seasonings to them before you dry them, and then you can have a tomato skin chip. Let's see. All right, let me go back to screen sharing. Share screen over here. All right, so in the handout, we have the dehydrating basics, and it talks a little bit more about crazing the fruit, fruit leather, more on pre-treating fruit to prevent it from darkening, blanching times, and rehydrating times. And that will be on the website, and you'll get an email with all the links to where the files are. Okay, so now we're going to go back to Chris, and she's going to talk about some herb mixes, a little teeny bit about grinding herbs, and then she's going to show you a dried chimichurri sauce and having it rehydrated. And so I'm going to send it over to Chris.
Hi, I'm going to show you some dried herbs and a chimichurri sauce. And I don't know if everybody can see me on the screen. It says Sue. Can you hear me?
I can see you, yeah. You're spotlighted,
Okay. Okay.
I think.
Usually I see. Okay. The chimichurri recipe calls, I have lots of herbs growing and they take over my yard. Anyhow, this has parsley, oregano, basil, and cilantro dehydrated, and red pepper, or you can use chili pepper, onion flakes, and the only two powders from your spice cabinet might be the chili powder, or you could grind up your own, or garlic powder. So with salt and pepper. To make a chimichurri sauce, here is the reconstituted sauce. You're going to add oil, your red wine vinegar, and your boiling hot water. So I'm going to do half a recipe.
Hey, Sue, are you there?
Chris is muted.
Yes, I accidentally muted her and I can't unmute her.
Okay.
Chris,
Let me
can you
unmute her. Okay, let me unmute her. She has to unmute herself. Okay, there she's unmuted.
Okay, that's why I was asking if you could hear me. Okay, are we ready?
Yes.
Okay, so I don't think anyone heard anything. You have the recipe. It calls for 2 tablespoons of parsley, oregano, basil, and cilantro that you can dehydrate. Onion flakes you can dehydrate. You can make your garlic powder from your dehydrated garlic, and your chili powder from dehydrated chilies, and red pepper flakes. And you can use bell or hot. I have made a mix out of that. And here is my chimichurri mix. And I'm gonna cut the recipe in half because I've done it 3 times. It's the 1/8 of a cup. Then you have 1 tablespoon of red wine vinegar.
Hey, Chris, could you move the camera down just a little bit? So I can see?
Okay.
Thank you.
How's that? You see? And 1 tablespoon of olive oil and boiling water. And let it sit for about at least a half an hour. I'm afraid my boiling water, I put in this for the demo. It's not that hot anymore. Just stir it up and let it sit, and it will rehydrate. I have it in a freezer container labeled. I could freeze it, but I think tonight I'm gonna put it on some ribs. So here is my chimichurri that we made up yesterday. I've made 3 batches and it is ready to go. It's labeled and rehydrated very nicely. I did have some other spices. I don't know if we have time to show. Sue, should I show spices and peaches?
Yeah.
Okay. I know Sue already did it. I got my pizzas done last night. Here is halves. And in this container, there's a new from Kerr. And that is a brand, but it has the moisture packets and a little, this was for the wide mouth, a little container to put it in to keep it off your food. Some people sell the moisture, save the moisture packets from pills because they're pretty food safe. They're in there with your aspirin. So here's this was a half of a peach. It was gigantic. So those were just made and those are ready to go. And I cut a few into slices. Nice little snack. So I'm trying these moisture packets this year. And I also have dehydrated onions, bell pepper, garlic, cilantro, everything I need for cooking, because you can add these to your favorite salsa recipe. Here's bell peppers. You're not supposed to change the recipe, but you can by adding dried spices. I really like salsa. And red peppers, that you could grind up and make your own chili. I have I crushed my leaves. Mint from the garden, mint takes over. I love it in teas. I have a little tea bags to put those in. Onion flakes, of course, you could add that to your salsa recipes. You saw garlic. Mine I crispied up. Grind that up for your garlic powder. Cilantro. Just have to not put off the stems. I did green peppers. Make sure you separate the green from the white when you're drying them, because they'll dry totally different. They're just like paper. And parsley. And then I made some mixes. This is kind of a Tex-Mex, and I ground it up to fine powder. I love sprinkling that on everything. I'm really into Mexican cuisine. I have an Italian blend that, because we use a lot of Italian food. And then to round off my kitchen for poultry, I have herbs du Provence. And I like this recipe because it has lavender in it and orange rind. It's a very interesting mix. And you have the recipes for all of that. And what's the last one? I think we talked about all of them. So you're ready to go. I have some grinding devices. You could use your mortar and pestle to grind. Stone works very nicely. Or I have my coffee blender, but this is one I really like because the whole thing comes apart and you can stick it in your dishwasher. Or you can grind rice or bread to remove the coffee. But I love having one I can take apart and wash, and it's really not going to have any flavors in it of anything else. Oh, my last thing I left up is when you do your peppers, make sure you wear gloves. You're going to want these.
Chris, your herbs are so bright and beautiful. And I agree with the using rice, or I like to use the bread for getting the smells out of the grinder.
Yeah.
When I've been grinding garlic, because then I have garlic flavored breadcrumbs that are ready to go.
Yeah, so I think you're ready to go on. Hopefully I did that quickly.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
And the next, I think we're going to go to break, or we're going to go to canning.
I think we're going to take a break. And so I just want to show you some of the things, the recipes that are in the handouts. We have some fruits, and then we have the herbs de Provence. We have the dry chimichurri mixes at the end on page 8, and then a Cajun spice recipe, fruit powders, all kinds of good stuff. So any questions? We are so far behind. I'm sorry.
Hey, Sue, that's okay. How about for anybody that does need to take a break, how about if we do our break now for 5 minutes, and that will give you both an opportunity to answer some of the questions that have been appearing in the chat. Would that work?
Sure. Okay,
so one of the questions was, going back to freezing, is how long can you freeze those veggies?
Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Most ask 6 months to a year. You want to watch the quality, that there's no freezer burn or moisture in there, and the color is good.
Okay, then the next question. Sorry, Chris. The next question is, what do you think of shrink wrap bags for freezing whole fresh chicken?
Yeah, just make sure that you pat it dry. And one thing I would do is there's going to be some moisture in the chicken. So a trick I learned from Dennis, one of our master food preservers, who's also a master gardener, is I will roll up a paper towel and put it just on the inside of where I'm going to seal it, so that when you vacuum seal it, it will absorb some of the liquid coming from the chicken and it doesn't impact the seal. But yeah, it works great. Those vacuum sealers are fabulous.
Oh, good. Another question is it better to have a frost-free freezer or one you have to manually defrost?
For the quality of the food, a manual defrost is better because that frost-free will, the way it keeps the frost away is it will warm it up enough so that the ice melts and then freezes back again. However, if you make sure that your freezer is full and you keep the temperature down low, it should be okay. And they've made great strides in the technology, but if you have a choice, I would check with the manufacturer to see how it handles that and impacts the quality of the food. But that's the challenge with the frost-free ones because they cycle on and off.
Okay, then this is going probably to Chris. There's a question that says, what brand model is the grinder used for making the dehydrated powders? Or maybe that's for...
Yeah, it was, this one actually is found in the store and it's just a Mr. Coffee. I didn't want to mention the brand. And my husband bought it when our past one broke and it just is perfect because it comes apart. And it does do a very good job. So this has been a great grinder for me.
Oh, good, good. Then now another question is just making sure that all the handouts, where to find them, and we're going to be, in addition to emailing to everybody, it will be on, I believe the plan is, Sue, isn't it, to have it both on the Master Food Preserver website and also the Tuolumne Master Gardener website?
That's correct.
Okay, I think we're caught up with questions. Did the presenters, do you guys need to take a break at all, or do you want to keep on going?
I'm good. I know it's going long, so if people need to drop off, you can, so you can watch the recording later, but we're gonna just continue.
That sounds great.
Information to share. It's really hard to condense it. And you get excited talking about, one topic and it brings up another idea. So, yeah. Oh, the shrink wrap bags are designed to dip in hot water to shrink around the chicken. Oh, okay. Oh, I don't know.
I have seen those used. My daughter uses them when they kill their own chickens and they put a hole in them and that they seal over because it shrinks up when you stick it in the chicken. It's used the way I've seen it when people are killing and producing their own chickens. There's a whole process and I have seen those used. So they have to pierce it. It shrinks the minute you go in the water, but you have to leave an escape valve and then you have to seal it. So please read your manufacturer's information on that product. The water has to be at a temperature, and I've just seen it commercially done. My daughter does it. So
we've had a few more questions come in. Do you guys mind answering them now, or do you want to wait until the end?
That's why we're here.
Okay, so another question is, what do you think about steam blanching?
It's fine. It's not as effective as boiling water blanching, but it works as well. There's some products that they recommend for steam blanching because the product may disintegrate a bit more in boiling water. And so on the recipe handout, it shows times for steam blanching and boiling water blanching when both of them are options.
Okay, so now there's a question. They didn't catch it if fruit, herbs, and veggies require boiling water to hydrate or just room temperature water for fruit. Also, undried tomato, wants your tomato skin recipe.
Okay, fruits you soak at room temperature water, vegetables it's at boiling water. And then undried, the tomato skin recipe, it's really easy. You just take your tomato skins and spread it out on your dehydrator tray. I like to sprinkle, I usually do salt and garlic mixture and then dry it until it's crispy.
Okay, then another question.
There's a recipe for tomato skin chips in the handout.
Okay, great. Another question is, what dehydrator do you think is the best?
The one that fits your budget and your needs.
Okay.
There's lots of them there. There's pros and cons to all of them. So the Excalibur and that other one, let's see if I can go back to it. So these guys here, with the fan in the back, the benefits are you don't have to rotate the trays like you do with these guys here. So that's one of the benefits, and the pros are you do have, or the cons on these guys, you do have to rotate the trays. You can also pull these trays out and you can make yogurt because you can have it nice and warm, but you are limited to these number of trays. With these stackable ones here, you can keep buying trays and you can expand the number or the amount that you use. The price for the Excalibur is a lot higher than these, so that's also an issue as far as cost goes, but they all work well. With the Excalibur, you can also purchase a version or a model that has a built-in timer. If you don't have a timer, you can just buy a plug-in timer that you use for your Christmas tree lights, or we have one at our chicken coop where it just you say here's the start time and the end time, so you can have your own timer that's attached to it. So it really depends on what you're looking for. They all work well. They just have different approaches, so there really isn't a favorite. I've used them. I've used a lot of them. I haven't used the digital ones yet. I've got some volunteers in Sacramento that have a digital version. It costs more. I like a manual version just because I figure there's fewer parts that are going to break. But as long as you don't ding them up and drop them, they all work well.
Since you're on the dehydrator subject, a question came in. It's, does the temperature matter for dehydrators?
Does the temperature that the dehydrator...
For certain foods, I'm assuming.
Yes. So like herbs, you want to dry it at a lower temperature because they are so thin. If you dry it at a higher temperature, you may cook it and they may burn up. With the others, the variations range between 135 and 140. There's not that much of a difference in the range there. You do need to be aware that the closer you get to being finished, the faster the food will dry. But you just need to make sure that you keep it at that low temperature, because if you have it too high, it'll cook the food and not dry it.
Yeah, and the only exception is jerky. I think that might be why.
Jerky, yeah.
It's 165. It's a high temperature. Usually there's a booklet that comes with your recommended times and temperatures with your dehydrator. So consult.
But most of the time, people aren't harvesting chickens from the gardens.
No, but jerky's the
yeah, jerky is much higher. Jerky. And with jerky, also you have to.
Not turkey.
We have another question, and it's what about vacuum packager with the canning attachment? What brand?
Whatever you find out there. I think I have an old Food Saver, but there's a lot of them out there, and there's I'm hoping someday mine will break so that I can get a new one that doesn't take up as much counter space. But as long as it has an attachment, you can just look online to find what they are. Most of them will have a vacuum canister attachment. If they don't, you should be able to buy an attachment if your machine has the little vent port. So just look for vacuum canister, vacuum sealer with canister attachment, and you should be able to find something and pick the one that's either at the store closest to you or in your price range.
Oh, good. I believe we're caught up with the questions at this point.
All right. Let me find where we are. Okay. Goodness, I have to talk fast. Okay. So are we ready to continue, Debbie?
Yes, we are.
Okay. So I'm going to talk, I say briefly, we'll see how that goes, about high acid canning, and then Chris is going to do a demonstration. And let's see. The basic thing that we do with high acid canning is we put the food in the jars. Oh, I gotta turn my video back on. Okay, so we put the food in the jars, we get rid of air bubbles, we wipe the jar rims, we put on the lids, we process it or we cook it in the canner, we let the jars cool, we remove the rings, wash the jars, and then we have a shelf-stable product. And so again, the reason that we're doing the canning is to make sure that we kill all foodborne pathogens that are in the jars. So this is the gist of what we're gonna do. And so I'm gonna talk about some different things. I'm gonna quickly go over canning tools. We've got funnels, that's how you get the food in the jar. There's some funnels where they sit inside the jar, some funnels sit on the edge of the jar. We've got ladles to get the product in there, headspace measurer. So the recipes will say you need a certain amount of headspace, and that's between the food, between the jar, the space between the food and the top of the jar. And so this little guy here measures that. Chris will show you hers. And a debubbler. You can either flip this upside down or you can use chopsticks or a separate tool to get rid of the bubbles in the jar. We have lids and rings. For the most part, we use the two-piece metal lid. And so there's the metal lid, it has a gasket on the bottom. And when we can, this gasket sits on top of the jar ring and it gets very soft during the canning. You take it out of the jar, when it cools, it hardens, and that's what completes the seal. You use these one time, and then we have rings. And if you've been canning for a while, you may not have read the box for your lids, but it says, you know, they're for one-time use, wash lids in hot soapy water, rinse well, and then set aside until ready for use. It used to be that you had to have them heated in boiling water. You don't need to do that anymore. The gasket material has been changed over the last 5-10 years, so it softens up just by putting it in the canner for even 5 to 10 minutes. So you don't have to worry about that. And then the jar lifter. This is how you take the jars in and out of the canners. You lift them straight up, straight over, and straight down. You go through all this work to clean your jars. You don't want to tilt them and put food on the jar rims. So those are the basic tools. And then the equipment that we use. Most people, when they think of canning, they think of a canner like this. It's an old enamel boiling water canner, works great. It has a rack inside where you can put the jars in, then you lower them down into the water. The water covers the jars. When you can it, or you're processing it, the water is above the jars, below the jars, and around the jars, and got the heat penetration. So that's the most common canner. There's newer models out there. This one here has a stainless steel bottom, so it'll work on an induction burner. But you don't even have to have a canner. You can just use a pot. You just need to make sure you have a rack on the bottom of the pot so the jars are not sitting on the bottom of the pot. And so that way you've got a little bit of space for water to go underneath the jars, and it protects the jars from the heat source. And so you can use any pot as long as it's deep enough. And if you don't have a rack for the bottom of the canner, you can take canning rings and twist tie them together and put them on the bottom of the pot and keep the jars off the bottom. So that's the basics for a boiling water canner. It's basically a pot. So now there's also steam canners. And I've got two variations here. You use the exact same recipes that you do for boiling water canning. People used to use steam canners a lot. And then a while ago, there was some concern that there might be pockets of cold air, and it wasn't one of the recommended canners. But in 2015, there was a couple of universities that got some grant money and tested it, and they proved that it is safe to use. This is my preferred method. I call it drought tolerant canning because you only use a couple of inches of water, and it takes a lot less time to bring a couple of inches of water to boil than a full canner. And so how this one works is we have a rack. It sits up a little bit. You can see on both of these models here, the rack is up about 2 inches or so. And so you fill the water just above the rack. You put your jars in there, you put the lid on there. You boil the water. When water boils, it makes steam. When the lid fills up with steam, you can't see it in this picture, but there's a little vent hole. This one has 2 vent holes on opposite sides, and steam is forced out of the canner. And so when you have a steady stream of steam coming out of the vent, that little vent port or hole, then you know you have a pure steam environment and you can start canning. This model here, it has a sensor on the top. and it has a little needle. And when the needle is in the green for your elevation, it should coincide when you have a steady stream coming out the side of the canner. And so it's time to can or start your processing time. And when you've got one of these, you can check and you'll know how accurate it is by just use. And you can tell, yep, I've got all the steam coming out, and at the same time as my gauge is over in this little knob. Range, the green zone. So that works out well. This is a handy reference tool, but you want to make sure that it coincides with the steam. The steam is the most important part. And then there's one company, Victorio, that makes a multi-use canner. And so it's a boiling water pot, and it has, you can see there's a rack on the bottom. It has vent holes, and it has one of the dial gauges. So you can use it for a boiling water canner, because there's some tomato recipes that you can use that are 50 to 60 minutes. And one of the restrictions on the steam canner is you can only process things for a maximum of 45 minutes. And that's just because you may run out of water if you boil it too long. And so if you have something that takes a long time, you need to use a boiling water canner. So this product here, it has a boiling water canner. And then what you do is you could take that rack, you flip it upside down, and then you put it upside down in the canner, fill your water above the rack, and then you can use it as a steam canner. I like to put another rack on top. I use a pizza pan that I turn upside down, and it has holes all along the bottom to give me a uniform flat surface to put my jars in, because otherwise there's too many little spots where my jars could tip. But anyway, we've got 3 different styles of canners: boiling water, AKA a pot, a steam canner, and then a multi-use canner that does both. So when we're prepping our food, we're going to put it in our jars, and it'll either call for a raw pack or a hot pack. Raw pack, you put raw food in the jars, in the hot jars. Hot pack, you put cooked food in the jars. They both have boiling liquid poured over them. The raw pack is faster, but you'll get more float. That's where the product rises to the top of the jar when you take it out of the canner. And that's because there's natural air in the food and it hasn't been driven out. When you do a hot pack, you cook the food, and so it removes the air from the food and it makes it more pliable. You can fit more product in the jar, so you'll have less float. It also is basically like blanching it beforehand, and the color will actually stay brighter and more vibrant longer in the jar, and it helps with the flavor. It's like I said, it's blanching it before you put it in there. The only drawback is it takes a little bit more work because you have to cook the food before you put it in, but it's maybe 5 minutes. So hot pack is the recommended way, and but you can do whichever you want when recipes say for a hot pack, do this, for a raw pack, or raw pack, do this. But if it only gives you a hot pack choice, that's all you do. And so I have a couple of examples here. We had a volunteer who made some spiced apple rings, and she did a raw pack and a hot pack. And on the hot pack, you can see she was able to fit more product in here. We still have a little bit of float, that's the space here, but not much. She had used one of those spiralizers to cut her apples, and they fit perfectly in the jar. So this is the raw pack where she put them in raw, and as you can see, there's a lot more float, and the jars kind of rearranged because they changed shape and they shrunk a little bit as they were cooking in the canner. And so it doesn't look quite as nice. There's no food safety differences. It's really just cosmetic and the amount of product you can get in the jar. But this is what it means when they talk about a raw pack or a hot pack. Okay, headspace I talked about a little bit before. It's the space between the product and the lid. If you have too little, because you're going to cram every last bit of product in that jar, the food may bubble out and over onto the jar rim during processing, and you may not have a good seal because you don't have a clean rim anymore. If you have too much headspace, because you figure, I'm not going to find another jar, and let's see how it seals. You may not get all the air out of the jar during the canning process, and you may have a very weak seal. And so there are a lot of times I will go ahead and can a jar that has too much headspace if I don't have a smaller jar that fits it perfectly. And then when it's done, I stick it in the refrigerator because I'm expecting the seal to fail. Okay, a couple of just very quick things on pickled products. Pickled products use vinegar. The most common pickled products are with vegetables, and vegetables are a low acid food. And so if you acidify them with vinegar, you make it a high acid food, and you can can them in a boiling water or a steam canner. But you need to make sure that you use a vinegar that's 5% acidity, and read the label. Rice vinegars are not 5%. You can find some bargain brands from other countries that may not be 5%. Make sure that it's 5%. And again, looking at grandma's old recipe, check the quantities. I always tell people find a current recipe and then use grandma's spices, because vinegar used to be 7% acidity, and then long before that it was 15% acidity. So the proportions of water and vinegar in your recipes may not be assuming that you've got a 5% acidity here. So current recipe, grandma's spices. And you can use any type of vinegar, white wine or white vinegar, white wine vinegar, red wine, apple cider. I like to make my pickled products with white wine vinegar. I think it gives it a smoother flavor. I've used champagne vinegar too, which has even higher acidity for a different flavor. But the white and the wine have a consistent color. If you use red wine vinegar or apple cider vinegar, it's going to change a lot of things, not the food safety, just the color and the flavor. And then when you're doing pickling, you want to make sure that you use canning salt. It's pure salt, and you'll see the only ingredient will be salt. If your salt has yellow prussiate of soda, it's an anti-caking agent. What that will do is make your brine cloudy, and then you look at it and you think, is something growing in there? My brine should be beautifully clear. So you don't want to use any anti-caking agents. And also the recipes call for canning salt, and you need to know that canning salt is much more dense than kosher salt. If you look at these two boxes here, and they're kind of representative of what they are in real life, this is a 4-pound box. It's very small and heavy. And then the kosher salt the boxes are quite a bit bigger, but they're only 3 pounds. And so if you measure out half a cup of salt, you're going to have actually less salt by weight if you're using kosher salt than canning salt. So you want to be using canning salt for the pickled products. Otherwise, if you could only use kosher salt, then you need to use it by weight. And I have, and I don't remember off the top of my head what we had found when we did our substitutions in the handout. Okay, going to switch to jams and jellies real fast. So when you make a jam or a jelly recipe, one of the first things that new canners say is, oh my goodness, all that sugar. There's a purpose for having all the sugar in the jam and jelly, and it's not just to make it taste sweet. It's actually the preservative, or it's the bodyguard of your jam. What it does at the molecular level is it binds with the water molecules. So the sugar and the water molecules bind together, and it's lowering the water activity, but essentially the water is not available for the pathogens to grow. If the pathogens can't grow, they can't make mold, they can't make fuzz and slime. So that's why we put the sugar in there. It also brightens the color and it makes it pretty nice. And you want to follow the recipe. If you want to use a sugar substitute, you can't use a regular recipe. You need to make sure you use one that calls for low or no sugar and the appropriate pectin, which we'll talk about in a moment. Sugar substitutes, all they do is sweeten. They do not preserve. So there's no little bodyguard in your sugars or in your jams and jellies when you use the sugar substitutes. And your sugar substitutes need to be stable at high heat. So there's really only 3 that are recommended for canning: your honey, Splenda, and stevia. The others are not, they will not work with the heat. So this is what you can use. And if you, let's see, no, I want to talk about pectin. Okay, so pectins. So pectins and the sugars, they work together. So most of your recipes out there, not most, but the most common recipes are for full sugar jams or jellies, and they call for just a regular pectin. And what's required is the sugar and the gel to work the sugar and the pectin to work together to make the gel. And so if you decide there's just way too much sugar, I'm going to cut the amount of sugar that I have in this recipe. It will still taste wonderful, but you won't have a jam or a jelly, you'll have a syrup, because you need the amount of sugar in the recipe and the amount of pectin to make the gel. If you want to cut down the amount of sugar, you need to use a low sugar recipe. and it will use a low sugar pectin. And those products use calcium to make the gel, not the sugar. And so when you're adding sugar or Splenda, it's just for flavoring. It's not the preservative. A key thing to remember is when you make a low sugar product like this, you don't have the preservative in there. So while it's canned, you've sterilized it so nothing's going to grow. But once you open it, even if you store it in the refrigerator, within a few weeks, it will start to mold because you don't have the sugar preservative. So I've got some examples here. There's the Sure Gel and Mrs. Wages. They have regular pectin. The pink box is the low sugar box, low sugar product. Ball's pectin used to be in boxes, but now they're in bulk containers. And when you peel back the little lid, it tells you for every 2 jars you want to make, here's how much sugar and pectin. And they have a low sugar version as well. And then there's another product out there called Pomona's Universal Pectin. And so all these 3 here, the Sure Gel, the Ball, and the Pomona, they all use calcium to make the gel because it's a low sugar product. And the Pomona Pectin, it has a separate calcium packet. And so there's an extra step to make some calcium water. And then their recipes say, add this many teaspoons of calcium water and this many teaspoons of pectin. So Pomona Pectin, you have to use their recipes because they're all science experiments. And then there's a couple of brands that also make a liquid pectin. And if you have a recipe for liquid pectin, you have to use a liquid pectin. You can't use any of the powdered pectins because the chemistry is completely different and the timing is different. You add the powdered pectins at the beginning of the the cooking process, and the liquid pectins get added at the end. So 2 different worlds. And then most of the powdered pectins and even the liquid pectins, you can make products and put them into the freezer. Some of them have some no-cook methods. And Ball also has a freezer pectin. It's called an instant pectin. It's the easiest thing in the world. You take sugar and your pectin, you stir it together, and then you mix in your crushed fruit, you stir it for 3 minutes, and you're done. There's no cooking involved. And so since you're not cooking the product, the color is bright and vibrant, and then you store it in the freezer, take it out, stick it in the fridge when you're ready to eat it. It's wonderful. But the big thing to remember on all of these is follow the recipe. Use the right amount of sugar, use the correct pectin, and follow the process, and then you'll have a good product. You're making jam, but you are also doing a science experiment. Okay, a couple of things on tomatoes. We acidify all tomatoes, always, even if you're going to be pressure canning. Tomatoes, they're borderline acidic and non-acidic, and it varies so much. The just general rule of thumb is always acidify so that you are guaranteed a safe product. And add it to the jars before adding the tomatoes. So that way you can look in all your jars and say, okay, I filled them all, and now I can put my tomatoes in. If we just added the acid, either lemon juice, citric acid, or vinegar, and I'll show you in a moment the quantities, if you just add it to the big pot, you don't know if you have enough in each jar. So we add it to the jars individually, then add the tomatoes, and then you're set. So how much? Here's the amounts. So for quarts and pints, it's 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. And again, it's bottled lemon juice because it's guaranteed to be 5% acidity, or a half a teaspoon of citric acid, or you can use vinegar. Citric acid is the one that impacts the flavor the least. I've been using lemon juice. I like the resulting flavor, but I'm going to try some jars with vinegar this year because I read that someone who had made it, or she didn't have lemon juice or citric acid, says, I've got to can the tomatoes today. So she used vinegar. And she said after about 6 months, the flavor was actually enhanced and she liked the flavor of it. So I'm going to try a couple jars with vinegar this year and see how I like the final product. Okay, salsa is a fun thing. So you can make some adjustments to salsa. Most of the time we tell you follow the recipe exactly, but you can make some changes with salsa. And so with tomatoes and peppers, you can make changes as far as the variety goes, but not the quantity. So if it says 4 cups of tomatoes, you can use any kind of tomato that you want. If it calls for 2 cups of peppers, if you like your salsa hot, you can put in some ghost peppers or jalapenos, habaneros, whatever you want, but the quantity needs to stay the same. And the same thing for onions. But remember, scallions are not considered onions in this case. So you wouldn't add scallions, but you can put sweet onions, Vidalia onions, yellow onions, red onions, whatever you want. So the quantity stays the same, the variety is what you can change. Okay, with acids, we're going to be using vinegar or commercial lemon or lime juice. And I have this marked in red because Ball's, excuse me, most recent cookbook has recipes for fresh lemon juice, but the most current USDA testing doesn't support that, and we haven't been able to get test results from Ball. So I know our specialists are trying to get funding to do testing to see if fresh lemon juice can be used. But until then, we use commercial lemon juice or lime juice. So things that you can switch. If the recipe calls for vinegar, you can swap lemon or lime juice instead of the vinegar, the same proportions. If it calls for lemon or lime juice and you want to use vinegar, you can't, because the vinegar is not as acidic as the lemon or lime juice. So you can't go from lemon lime to vinegar, but you can go from vinegar to lemon and lime. You're actually adding more acidity that way. And then spices, this is where you get to play. And Chris was talking about a lot of the spice mixes that she uses. You can adjust dried spice type and quantity. So you can have any spice varieties that you want in there. They're all dried ingredients. That way you can have your secret blends that everybody just raves about. So quantity for the tomatoes, peppers, and onions, you can swap lemon and lime instead of vinegar, and then go crazy on your own custom spice blends. All right, so a quick note, since we are not living at sea level, all recipes that you'll find in cookbooks and canning books are designed at sea level for the processing time. At sea level, water boils at 212. The higher up you go, it's not going to get to 212. So what we have to do is we can it longer instead, since we can't get to 212 degrees. All the recipes at the National Center for Home Food Preservation and in our handout list the processing time for different elevation ranges. Most of the time when you're looking at canning books, even if they're based on a reputable recipe or based on research, most of them don't say, here's all the different elevation ranges. They'll just say process for 15 minutes. And then some of them will say adjust for altitude. But if you don't do it all the time, you got to go back and find the section where it tells you how to process it. So make sure that when you're canning, if you're higher than 1,000 feet, you know how much time you're supposed to add. And this is just a general cheat sheet. Okay, I'm almost done. All right, so I want to go over quickly the process for the boiling water canner. I'm not sure where this blue line came from. So you're going to start by using a reputable recipe. And one of the handout items that I'll be giving you or posting online is a cheat sheet of the steps for boiling water and steam canning. I like to take them and put them in a plastic sleeve and just stick them on my canner. So that way I've got a reminder, and it works well for people who are new to canning, so they have a checklist of things to go through. So we start with a reputable recipe. You're going to prep your food and heat your jars. Put them in the canner to heat them. I've had people say, well, I want to heat them in the dishwasher. Well, you can, but you've got a canner going there, and you put the jars that you're going to use, put them in your canner. So you want to heat the canner water, not to boiling. If you're doing a hot pack, you want it to be simmering at about 180 degrees. A raw pack, it's cooler at 140 degrees, so it's hot water. But you want to be able to bring the water and the temperature inside the jar, since it's raw food, up to the temperature together. Then you're going to put your jars in the canner. They're going to have 1 to 2 inches of water over the top of the jars. Remember that headspace measurer? You can use that to double check that you've got enough water in the jars. For longer processing times, over 30 minutes, that's when you want to have 2 inches of water, because you don't want the water to boil down and get too low. So your jars are in there, they're on the rack. You put the lid on, you crank up the heat to high, and then you wait till the water boils. And when you have a vigorous boil, you start your timer, because your recipe will say process for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, however long. You're going to make sure that you adjust for altitude, so you may be processing for 20 minutes instead of 15. And then you're going to adjust the heat. You want to get a gentle boil. I like to describe it as a smooth jazz boil, not a heavy metal acid rock and roll boil. It's the same temperature. And if you have a very vigorous boil, you may be shaking your jars around in the canner. They may bang into each other. They may fall over. So all you need is a smooth, gentle boil. It's the same temperature. And then when the timer goes off, you turn the heat off and you take the lid off, and then you wait 5 minutes. And it's just so things can settle down and cool down, and it helps with the float in the jars. And then after 5 minutes, then you take the jars out and then you cool them on the counter, put them on a towel or a cutting board or a tray, something to protect them from the cold surface, and you let them cool for 12 to 24 hours. And then after that, you take the rings off, you wash your jars, you label them, and you stick them in the cupboard. And so one of the links we'll be giving you is to an MFP video library and our statewide website. And it has a collection of videos from extension offices around the country. Some of them are a few years old, and so they will still talk about preheating the lids and things like that, but you'll still be able to see the process. So that's how you do boiling water canning. And I'm going to quickly go over steam canning because it's very similar. And then this is what Chris is going to demonstrate with a mango salsa recipe. Okay, again, you use reputable recipes, you heat the water, the jars go in the canner, and remember the water just goes above the rack down here. Put the lid on, high heat. So now you wait for that steady column of steam. And when you've got that, you start timing. And it should be the same time as your temperature sensor is in the green zone. Again, you adjust for altitude, so you may need to process longer than the recipe calls for, and you've got a maximum of 45 minutes for processing time. If you at a higher elevation and your adjustments for altitude put you at canning something for 60 minutes, then you need to use a boiling water canner. So again, you adjust the heat. You want a smooth jazz boil. If you have a really heavy boil, you may see that the lid pops up a little bit and it'll kind of float. Sometimes it does something called a burp, and it will lift up enough to let out some steam, but it sucks in some air as well. And so you want to make sure that you've got a nice tight fit and that the lid stays down. And then when the timer goes off, you just turn the heat off. Don't take the lid off. That would be the same thing as taking the jars out immediately. So just let everything settle in there. Leave the lid on for no more than 3 minutes, so 2 to 3 minutes, and then the lid comes off away from you. Take the jars out, again, put them on the counter on a towel or some kind of protected surface, and let them cool. If any of the jars don't seal, then you put them in the refrigerator. Some products you can reprocess, but depending on what it is, the quality, if you're cooking it twice, may not be as what you're looking for. So usually it's just put it in the refrigerator and that's what you're having for dinner the next couple of days. Okay, so Chris is going to demonstrate a mango salsa. It's on page 19 and she's going to use a steam canner. So I'm going to stop my share. And Chris.
Hi.
Hi.
The mango salsa recipe I found is also good for peaches, and it's listed that way in the USDA guide. So if you have a lot of stone fruit, I just chose mangoes. It's excellent on poultry, fish. I even like it as a dip. So I'm doing half the recipe today, and I'll hold up the objects and adjust this so you can see my pan. Okay, so the half of recipe, I have my water and my vinegar already measured out in this bottle. So I'm gonna just dump that in. I have pre-cut and measured all my produce. That's in here. We're gonna be using pepper flakes and ginger, brown sugar, and bell pepper and onion, and of course my mangoes. So we'll add those all to the pot. And what takes you the longest is, of course, if you're chopping up your peaches or your mangoes, is getting them off the pit. It does suggest not a super ripe, but a green, hard fruit. Or that will make your best salsa. And our spices. our brown sugar. So it is a sweet and savory sauce. I think it's, you can even put it on a burger. It'll take them, it only cooks for 5 minutes once it comes up to a full boil. Let's see. It's all in the pot. It's very colorful. This will take a few minutes. I have heated my jars, and I have enough for our magic time later, but while that is cooking, I'll just show you some of your tools. I have an extra spoon because when I take it out, it may drip between the stove and my canning jar. I have my funnel. I have jar lifters, if you haven't seen those before. And then we have our head measure, and this is a debubbler. I have an extra spoon for scooping out if I go over. We have our ladle. And I'm using a foam remover because it also asks to strain out some of the solids and liquids. Your jar lids should be washed and prepared and set aside. Check your lids for any dense rust. And make sure you examine the lids of the jars. Make sure there's no cracks. Run your finger around, the threads are intact, no bubbles. Even when you buy them brand new, make sure you inspect them. We have found damaged jars. Okay, so while this is just starting to come to a boil, not quite a full boil. And I think I'll take you over, and when I hear that boiling, I'll set my timer for it to cook down for 5 minutes. So over here, I have some products that you might be interested in making from your garden. There's a lot of stone fruit. This is an apricot jam made from dried apricots. Sue has included the apricot with peppers, habaneros, or if you wish to use a less hot one, it has the liquid pectin. Also in the past, we've done the peach zesty salsa. It's very pretty. It has peaches and hot peppers in it. I enjoy it. In fact, I'm doing that tonight in a slow cooker with some ribs. Then we have some pickled fruit. These are plums, peaches, and figs. They'll be coming up in the fall. And I tried cherries this year. You'll be interested in salsa. And remember, you can spice that up and down with adding dehydrated. Of course, we have recipes for spaghetti sauce. On your veggies, I tried mixing up my standard recipes. This one has turmeric and dried peppers in it. And this one I tried adding some thyme and smoked paprika for something different this year. So I changed the standard recipe. We have pickle roast, a favorite of my family. We're down to 1 jar. And I also have tried a daikon and carrot pickles, which are great to throw them on some shredded pork and make a Vietnam sandwich. And this is chayote and jicama, just a different type of relish. Of course, I have to have the jalapenos. And interesting was trying the yellow beets, and they really lightened up that I did the pickling process. And we have our bread and butter and our dill pickle slices. Also, I tried Sue's favorite, the pickled watermelon rind. So we can see that this has come to a full boil. Stir. It's almost ready for the timer to set. You want the boil not to be stirred down. So it's not quite, it's almost there. So we're going to set the timer when I cannot stir down my boil for 5 minutes. Still not quite there.
So Chris,
Yes.
how about while it's cooking for the 5 minutes, we answer some questions?
Sure.
That would be perfect. We've got a question and it says, my jar lifters always get rusty no matter what I do. Is it okay to use them if they have a bit of rust on them?
I have some very old ones. These have a rubber and you don't want to scratch or mar your jars. So this would be okay. I know if they're put in an acidic solution, like I put vinegar in my water bath canner, I noticed that it had a tendency to pit and make even the rack rusty. And that's going to discolor, you know, every time you use it, the water gets brown, which is kind of ugly. So I'd say as long as it had a rubberized grip that is not going to chip or damage your jar, it'd probably be good. She probably has the very old ones. I have some old ones with wooden handles. I think I prefer using a non-rusted or a plastic coated. You just don't want to damage your jar. If it's good to go, you can probably take an SOS pad or fine steel wool and you can buff that rust off, but make sure you dry it and not have it in acid. Okay.
Yeah, because since it's not touching the food, the big concern is just, you know, scraping the jar.
Just the jar.
Okay. Do you want to take another question?
Sure. This is just a boil for 5 minutes. It's a,
okay.
I mean, so it's a full boil and this is not going to be stirred down. So this is what you're looking for.
Okay. It looks
Boil
beautiful.
back, not, it's very pretty. Not stir down and then you start doing.
Okay. Another question is, if the recipe calls for a pint jar, can I use a half pint for the same amount of time as the pint jar? And on the same idea, if I want to use a pint jar instead of a half pint, how do I adjust the process time?
You need to look at the recipe. So
Yeah.
if the recipe has a time for both of them, then if you're going with a smaller jar, you would still use the full processing time. But if the recipe only has timing for a half pint jar, you wouldn't substitute a larger jar. So you would need to put it in the right size container. You can go smaller, but not bigger.
We have the question, it's a clarification. She meant as far as the jar lifter piece, the question about the jar lifter, she meant the jar lifter piece that is in the boiling water canner,
Yeah.
the big round piece that is at the bottom and is removable.
That is what has gone rusty on my old enamel canner, and I got rid of it. And that was from adding acid to the water. I have a well and I add acid so I don't have a white buildup. And it does make the water dirty. I just went to a stainless steel water bath with the stainless steel rack that you lift out. And then I haven't had problems with it going rusty. And that seemed to be because I was adding, like I said, the vinegar to the water. I think it's just all cosmetic. It doesn't make the water brown. And my only worry was, you know, the looks of your jar.
Okay,
Chris can,
so if
Chris
you're talking about, so Debbie, so the,
yeah,
The whole rack
this is
that
the
you
rack
lift
that
out.
comes up, yeah.
Yeah.
right. I believe so. And then Chris, I've got a question for you. I noticed that you have, is it a timer that you're using?
This is, there's several different ones. This is by Taylor. Or you can use your phone timer.
Okay, okay.
And I don't start this timer until it said to come to a full boil that did not get stirred down. That's what we were waiting for. And you may
Okay.
want to lower your flame a little bit. you can look while it cooks, as long as it's boiling, you can turn it down a little bit once it gets to that rock and roll boil.
Debbie, can I
Yes.
continue on about the rusty jar lifter, which is the rack? So one of the things you can look at too is there's new silicone racks that you can put on the bottom, and so they wouldn't get rusty. So you can use something like that to put on the bottom of your canner if you have hard water. So there's that. You can use cake racks if they're round. There's heavy duty plastic and silicone baskets I've seen. So there's a wide variety of things, but a silicone rack might be a better choice because then it wouldn't get rusty.
I have an aluminum tray from my pressure canner, and that also fits in the bottom. You could try that if she has one, because they're aluminum, at least in my case.
Okay, those are great answers.
And I'm looking at, there's a question about from Nan. I believe there's a recipe on an approved site for mixed vegetables that does not use lemon juice. It says you can use any mix of veggies, including tomatoes, then you pressure can it. And so, yeah, but that's pressure canned, and so there's a difference there. You don't want to pressure can your salsas. You would have mush at the end. So salsa is not recommended to be pressure canned. But yeah, there's lots of vegetable mixes if you're just going to be canning them by themselves. So that's an option also.
Okay, so we're getting down to 10 seconds. So I'm going to take out my jars. I heated them. Lift your lid away. And there goes my timer. I wanted to show you when I lift these jars up, try to do this one-handed, you'll see with the steam canner that you turn them upside down and the water forces up. And you lift them, be very careful because it's going to drop right down, and then put it on your towel and let them there. So it looks like all your water disappeared, but it's just up in the jar. And I heated these. Back. We have hot half pints. Sometimes I do the smaller pint with leftovers. I don't have a full jar. And also it makes a nice gift for someone that wants a small batch or is just cooking for themselves. And as you see, all the water went down there and it's still covering your rack. Okay. And just go over how to fill these jars. Okay. So
Move the camera down just a little bit more.
Like that? How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, so we have a hot jar right out of our steam canner and put it down. I'm gonna put my funnel, and in this recipe, it asks you to put the solids in and then put in the juice. It doesn't have a lot of juice, and I usually just push my jar against, but the proper way is to hold this over your crack right there so it doesn't drip between your oven. I'm going to put my solids in. They have a 1/2 inch head space.
I like having that plate there, Chris.
I'm not what do you call a neat canner. I'm always dripping, so I must have my reserves. There's my 1/2 inch. And there we go. I think that's fine. And then it asks you to put your juice in. It's easier to put the juice in at the end after you fill the jars. So, and we'll probably have to tip this because this is a small batch. Yesterday, Sue and I practiced because I quite frequently have my internet and I didn't know if you'd see a video of me. So, made a short dress rehearsal video. So I don't know if that's going to be a full jar. The next one, Maybe we'll just do a little half jar and eat it. So after a while, you can tell by looking at your rims if you put too much in. It's a very pretty salsa, and I love to have the ginger. So looks like that's gonna work. Take one more out. Okay. All right, we're ready to add our liquid. So I'm putting it back, and I might just put all my extra in there. Let's see. Oh, maybe there is a full jar in here. Okay. See how well it goes down.
And I like Chris's technique of using a separate debubbler, because when you use the headspace measurer, then you flip it upside down, all the product just dribbles down onto your hand.
Yeah, and as it looked over full, but then when you push down your product, the air bubbles come out and the liquid just kind of sunk in there. This is packed pretty, and then check. You'll see with the liquid, maybe a hair out. And some of the mangoes are floating up. I think that's about good.
And Chris is paying and spending a good amount of detail on this because she enters things in the county fair as well. And one of the things that we're doing, I'm not sure if the publicity has gone out yet, but since we didn't have the Amador County Fair this year, the Master Food Preservers are going to be doing a fair judging project, and I believe it's the first weekend in September. And so we're getting publicity to go out where people can submit preserved food, and then we've got some Master Food Preservers in other counties who will be judging them. And so people can still get blue ribbons at the fair. So I'm betting Chris will have things in there too, because she makes it.
Oh, I don't know. I volunteered to help. We'll see. I don't need any ribbons.
You just have the good food.
Well, I just give it to my kids, and you know, like someone already called and said, "Hey, don't have any more pickle relish." And so this one, because I did not, pack the solids in and pour the liquid in them at the end of the jar, it's a little loose, but it still would be a safe product and, good. Maybe you wouldn't want to use this jar for dipping. So that's a half. And I still have a little bit for a small jar. And I don't care. I'm not going to throw the juice away. I would definitely put it on some chicken or fish. I tried this on salmon. I really like that. Sorry. Now this jar is almost.
Don't knock it over.
Yeah, I know. Don't knock it over. I always do that. So we're ready to clean our jars up and seal them. I'll get everything out of her way. That jar is low, but I'm going to seal it anyhow. You stick your paper towel.
And that'll go in the fridge because it probably won't have a good seal, huh?
Yeah, and I might have that. I might put that on my ribs. My husband doesn't care for all the weird things I do, but I'm going to clean it just to make sure. Make sure your cloth does not go in. Dip it in. Get another jar. It's hot. You want to make sure there's no drips, and you're more concerned with your threads and your top rim. Do not stick inside the jar. And then we're gonna put our lids on. So, and that one's not perfect. Okay, so when you put your lid on, if you wanna be formal, you wanna line up your marks on the jar. There's somewhere you'll find where the lid, this one has marking for either a name or put your tag on it, and you line them up, and then you put your band on. I hold it in place.
Can you move the camera off to the side or move the jar? There we go.
Hold
Yeah,
it in
thank you.
place. Yeah, I'll put it on the side. You do that. Okay, so put it down. It's on there, and I'm going to put my finger. I like to put my finger and press down, make sure it doesn't move, and finger tight. Just firmly on there, not super tight, because it's going to change. And sometimes you'll see they loosen up when they cook, but your lid is sucked down there, and it's in good shape. So I put it on firmly, and you should always check your water level and have a kettle of hot water, which I boiled before we started, in case you have to add before you start the cook time. Not during. You never lift your lid. So everything's on there. And I'm going to put my lid on, and we'll try to get some steam. There's a steam hole. I'm going to pull it over here closer to the camera. We're going to start. The processing time is 15 minutes at my altitude, and I cannot start it until my arrow gets to the green. So I'll try to get that steam up there so you can watch it.
In the meantime,
I'll show you how to take them off the flame and out of the pot. And the pot is cool. If you were doing it afterwards, you let it cool down for 3 minutes with the steam can, or keep your lid on. And make sure when you take this lid off that you're opening it away from you. So any steam remaining in your pot after you've done the 3 minutes of coming down in temperature does not hit you in the face. Then your finished product is sitting here, and it's safe to remove it.
Pick of TV.
There is your half pint. And a four ouncer. And yesterday I was short of little jars. Ran around and I used up some jelly last night. So, and lift them straight up and straight across, and do not tip. That's the biggest thing. And this would sit, and we're not going to be able to hear that today because you'd have to wait. It will pop. You'll either hear it when you take the lid off. You'll start hearing the lids as they cool down pop, and they are sucked down. So these actually were made yesterday during our practice session. This is on. The only thing left for me to do is label them, and you're going to take off your band, and you're going to wash them in warm soapy water. And this lid should be so tightly on that you can submerge it and nothing's going to come off. If it does, you know you don't have a good seal. This is my example. And when you put a label on it, I don't know if you can see. I'm dipping it. Make sure you put the date, most important. This says ASC for atmospheric steam canner. Let's see, I think my lighting. And it says the amount of time and the altitude, and then I list the ingredients, which is good for people if you're giving it away if they're allergic to something. So there's a lid. And so you just take them off after they're cooled and wash them well in soapy water. Make sure your ants aren't going to enjoy visiting your jars. And then you're done. This is still not there for me to start my timer for 15 minutes. Sue, do you have anything else you need?
Well, I think there's a couple of questions, so let's
Okay.
got some more questions, and then we'll
There,
come to that.
right. There's a question that says, can you add an additional rack and jars to the steam canner to process more jars as long as they fit nicely into the canner?
Yes, with the steam canner, as long as you're not touching your lid, you want space left up there. Like if I had a rack of these 4 ounces, I could put my pressure canning plate that fits in the bottom of my pressure canner on top of it, and I can set 4-ounce jars on top. You don't have too much more space, but the little 4-ounce jars usually fit on top of a second stack and just the same processing time.
And this challenge is making sure you have jars that are all the same height on the bottom.
Yeah, and you can do that also in the water bath. I just happen to have a pressure canner rack that will fit right down in there. And it's very stable, so that's a good thing for me to use.
And with the boiling water canner, you can stack them, but the big challenge is still having a deep enough pot to have 1 inch to 2 inches of water above it.
Yeah, so only usually the short jars. And if I'm using quarts, probably not at all. They're not going to fit.
You need a 2-foot tall pot.
Yeah, that's not going to work at all. But I can do the little 8-ounce with the 4-ounce. Probably, I think I might be able to get actually 2 of these 8 ounces. I would have to try that. I can't remember. I'm usually putting the little ones on top. So that's what goes.
Okay.
I'm still not in the green.
Well, then I'm going to jump back to the shared screen, and Chris, let me know when it's in the green so we can see it.
Okay.
So let's see. So we've got that. Let's see. So we got the salsa. So the handouts that you guys are going to get, that'll be online, and you'll have the email link sent to you. The food safety basics, freezing, dehydrating, core canning, and then actually I put all of them in one, so you don't have to do. Start my video. Okay. So you can have them all in one document. I've got the document on fruit spreads, so it talks about sugars and pectins and making juice. I have one on pickling fruits and vegetables, so it gives you a lot more information about that. And then the 25 pages of recipes. And I'm also going to include canning cheat sheets. And so we'll list the steps. And then we'll also give you the links to the recordings, and then the link to the video library. It's on the statewide Master Food Preserver site, and a link to the National Center for Home Food Preservation. There's lots and lots of great information. And let's see, I think that's it. We've been answering questions as we go. We lost a couple of people. Again, I apologize for the length. I think we're a little overambitious. Next time, Debbie, I need to just pick one topic.
No, you're doing great. I mean, this is all really wonderful information. Maybe, Sue, can you talk about maybe some of your classes, your future classes that you're planning to do?
Do you want
And
me
how?
to do a steam jet?
Is it showing? Is it working now?
Yes.
Ready? Okay, yeah, let's go back and take a peek at that.
So there's a hole in my pot. Can you see it? Oh, I saw it. No, I don't see it.
It's hard to see the steam. Oh, I see the steam come off the side.
Usually you can see. I can see it against my black countertop. There's steam going out 6 to 8 inches, and it's in the green. So this is what it looks like. You can hear the whistle too.
I see some now, yeah.
If I tip it down, you can see against the black countertop. And now you're ready to start your timer. For me, it's 15 minutes.
And so this is an example also, because a very high, strong stove. And so you can see how the lid lifts up. And so she's going to turn the heat down, because once you've got it hot in there, you can actually adjust it to almost a fairly low temperature, because
Okay.
because you want to make sure that you still have the steam coming out, but it's not so strong of a boil inside that it keeps lifting the lid up.
Yeah, I think I've got mine set up, and you can see the steam. I don't know if you can see
I see it.
There,
Yeah.
you can see the steam better. There, it puffed away.
So at this point, then when the timer goes off, Chris showed us taking the lid off and taking the jars out. It's a lot, one of the things I like about the steam can, and one of the many things, is that it's a lot easier to lift and carry a pan with just a couple of inches of water as opposed to the full pot. And you can find, well, I don't know if you can find them now because everybody's looking for canning equipment, but the version on the right is an older style that has the two vent holes. And so hopefully people can find those in thrift stores or garage sales and things like that, or maybe grandma's attic or barn, because steam canners work very nicely. They're a lot easier. And actually, I get lazy and I just have my jars in the canning rack, and then I fill the jars right on the steam canner.
You're neater than me.
I use that spoon underneath my ladle.
Oh, I would still spell it. That's why I put my plate right against my pot is mine.
Yep, I like that. I like that. Okay, so Debbie mentioned upcoming classes. We're working on that. This was kind of a practice session for us. At this time, we aren't allowed to meet in groups, and so we're trying to put together a couple more online classes. The statewide Master Food Preserver site has classes that are around the country, or not around the country, across California. So when other Master Food Preservers are doing virtual classes, we'll list them there as well. And I know that there's a Solano Yola group that Friday does an Ask a Master Gardener Master Food Preserver session. And so people can ask questions there. We're working on putting a couple more online classes. I don't have any dates yet. We just got to get people trained and comfortable to do the videos. Chris, thank you so much for doing this video today. If people,
I'm gonna have to go. I have to meet someone at 1 o'clock to get heads.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chris.
Okay.
Thank you. And I guess, Sue, if anybody did have more questions, there is the, it's like the hotline, but for the Master Food Preservers, right? So they could always
Ask a Master Food Preserver on our website.
Right, but this has been wonderful. There's quite a few people that have posted their thanks into the chat section, and we sure appreciate that. We appreciate everybody hanging in there. You can find this recording, as we mentioned earlier, and I am, just to let you know, I'm going to stop recording.